What do they want from us? Look at all that we've done for them. And I looked at him and I said, let's begin with the fact that I'm not white. I will tell you what we want. We want you to treat us like we are human, not a subspecies, not inferior, human. What we want is for you to stop shooting us in the back. And I continued to rant. And I finally said, I don't want to hear about Roe versus Wade, because the truth of Roe versus Wade is that you do not care how many women of color have an abortion. If you could pass a law that said that no Northern European white woman would have an abortion, you would not care how many women of color do. Tell me I'm wrong. He couldn't do it. So don't confuse their objection to Roe versus Wade with truly being pro-life, because they're not. They don't want white women having abortions because of race suicide. Do you see my point?
Yes, it's nice to see how that loops back to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to clear the screen. We're going to take a brief break. We're going to come back and try to bring this to a conclusion. Hopefully 9:20ish. I will take attendance as well. Make sure you get your extra points. Okay. One of the dominant figures of the 19th century whom we do not hear about I think I've been very clear. I have little respect for Charles Darwin. I have no respect for Spencer. I have no respect for Alfred Wallace. George Jacob Holyoake was born to a poor English family. He learned to read when he was 17 years old at Sunday school. He went on to become a social reformer. He published an unbelievable number of books because he also learned how to write. He was the editor of multiple papers, including one called The Secularist, and one called The Reasoner. He was incredibly influenced by Comte, and therefore endorsed the new religion of man. Before we talk about that, there were two experiences as a boy that shaped his life. By the way, he also had very bad eyes. For those of you who had never met me and don't know, I have an eye disease. I don't have functional irises. So if you were in a classroom with me, you would probably never see anything except my sunglasses, because without my sunglasses, I'm blind. So the two experiences. Number one, at 7 years of age, he went to work. His father worked in an iron smelting plant, and his mother had a small business that made buttons And back in the day, they had a machine called a lathe, Lathe, which spun in a circle. They would put a bone in the lathe, and then using a special knife, they would cut sections of the bone to make buttons. So at 7 years old, he's working on the lathe in a hut behind the house, and his scarf gets caught in the lathe. He would have been killed if someone did not hear him screaming and saved his life. When he was 10, his younger sister, who was 7, had tuberculosis. One day, his mother got a letter from the Church of England in which she was charged interest for not paying her tithe. She knew that if she did not immediately pay the tithe and the interest, the church would come and take everything she owned away. For reasons that are not clear, because Holyoke never tells us, his mother got detained at the church, and by the time she came home, his sister had died. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what Holyoke's mother must have felt like to come home and find her daughter dead? It would have been brutally devastating. So, Holyoke became the founder of a position called a key ally was Harriet Martineau. Even though she's not well known now, she was one of the driving forces of the 19th century. Example, she was the primary translator of Comte's works into English, which were read by George Holyoke. She also became a staunch defender of secularism. So when you think about this, how do you think the Church of England reacted?
Probably not all too kindly.
No, they didn't. And Holyoke and Wilson and a number of his followers repeatedly went to jail. But the key to keep in mind was this: The church argued that secularism was atheism. And despite the fact that Wilson, Holyoake, and numerous others, including Harriet Martineau, argued that secularism was not, by definition, atheism, they lost. They lost. From secularism in the 20th century, we will get what is called socialism. What does the far right say about socialism? Atheism. All right, any questions about this before I go on to the next point?
No questions.
Yep. Was that a
No,
question?
I'm sorry. No questions. Thank you.
Since we're running out of time, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Marx, except that Marx said that a communist revolution was most likely to happen in the United States, England, France, and Germany. And between 1880 and 1920, with people like Eugene Debs, that nearly happened. If it weren't for the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, and all of Europe would be communist. That is all that stopped the communist revolution. So here's what happened. In the United States and in England in the 1880s, there is significant social unrest. At the same time that this is happening, we have the Third Great Awakening. So, beginning in 1840, there is a hard swing to the right, to a conservative, fundamentalist Christian view of the world that, at least in theory, won't tolerate social unrest, won't accept social reform, sees secularism and socialism as atheism. The West begins to go into collapse. We cannot underestimate the impact of World War I. An entire generation of European men was destroyed. And when Americans came back, there's a surge in discontent in the United States as well. In 1929, the stock market collapses and we begin the Great Depression. If it weren't for the New Deal, a massive program of social welfare, the United States economy would have collapsed and there would have been a communist revolution. During this period, Secularism declines. Holyoake is dead. All of his primary disciples are dead. And secularism begins to struggle for an identity. In 1932, they published the first Humanist Manifesto. They will continue to revise the first Humanist Manifesto into the 21st century. And while there are people who are dedicated to what is now called secular humanism, by the middle 1930s, they are largely marginalized. Ironically, in the same period, beginning initially in 1918 through 1935, largely as a result of the impact of the First World War, Christianity seriously struggles. And at the same time that the Humanist Manifesto is being published, the World Council of Churches is born. In theory, it wants to determine what it means to be a Christian in the modern world and how a Christian should respond to social problems. Except that promise will never be fulfilled. They spend more time trying to find common ground amongst all of the participating Christian churches than they do trying to solve the social problems of the world. The World Council of Churches continues to this day, and they still don't have an answer. In 1956, as the debate continues, the World Council of Churches releases its famous paper on social justice. Like everything else released by the World Council of Churches, it's largely a failure because it doesn't come up with a Christian ethic. It concludes that the church should teach Christians how to be socially responsible. So instead of responsibility falling on the church, it falls on individual Christians. So it shouldn't be surprising that by 1960, church attendance is falling. And it should be no surprise that around 1960, the Fourth Great Awakening The birth of the religious right, 1960, 1980. In the same period, the death of God movement. The death of God movement essentially said, this becomes Christianity without God. Which means that Christianity is not a religion. It's just another ethical system. It is just another ethical system. All right, are there any questions about this before I begin summing up? Everybody good?
Yep.
Okay, we have a message. Okay. Particularly in third world countries, liberation theology for about a 10-year period will be extremely powerful. By the middle of the 1980s, it's going to begin to fade. Marxism and Christianity don't work well together. So by the end of the 20th century, for all intents and purposes, Christianity is bankrupt. If you recall from an earlier lecture, we talked about situational ethics. Only the moment matters. Intention and consequence don't figure into the equation. I'm supposed to determine what the most loving thing to do in the moment is. By 1968, when you add John Stuart Mill and the principle of harm to this, what you end up with is exactly where we are now. We are morally bankrupt. We do whatever we can justify, and we don't think about the consequences either for ourselves or for the society as a whole. If you think about everything that we've talked about tonight, if you put technology, which we do not understand the social implications, the moral implications of the technology we use. If you put them into this equation, the result is sexting, canceling, ghosting, gaslighting, and we become an inherently selfish society. Technology has a habit of making social problems worse, not better. And if we don't know what it means to be human, what happens at some point in the future? Well, when we tell that silicon life form sitting across the table from us that it can't do something, and it looks back and very calmly says, I will do what I want. What then? I'm not looking for an answer. We don't have one. And that is why the next 30 years are so dangerous. I'll remind you that in a couple of weeks, you will read a series of articles on technology and job loss. And MIT very clearly says, at the rate we are going, by 2038, 80% of our population will never make enough money to survive. How do we pretend to have a consumer-based economy when no one has money to consume? Once again, we're not thinking about the implications. Or maybe we can't see the implications because they exist outside our intellectual paradigm. Any last questions? Okay. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to stop the recording, but hang on and don't go away so I can take attendance, okay?